Well, hello everybody, and as you sort of settle in, I just wanted to say how excited I am to have leading the conversation for this session. I've got Linda, Chris and Jenny with me, who I'll introduce shortly. So this is the parallel session on organisational governance residential. So if you're in the wrong place, you can do the walk of shame across the front. So I'm the Executive Director that looks after compliance and enforcement group in the Commission. So I work at the sharp bottom end of the regulatory diamond. So one thing I can say in the role I'm in is I often have a few difficult conversations, but one of the endearing features of the aged care sector is when I'm talking to providers, even if they're talking to me through gritted teeth, is you are a professional and respectful bunch. And what it really sort of highlights for me is that really, and it's been said a number of times, that we've all got a vested interest in making this sector as good as it possibly can be, because we're all on the bus towards old age, subject to no unfortunate event, and with some of us a bit closer to the front of that bus than others. And really, what we build, we get to inherit. So I think that's why this is in such an important topic, and it's so important to be having this opportunity to talk with you as a sector. So look, I want to make this as conversational as possible. So please use the app to put questions through, but also if you come up to the mic, perhaps just tap it, because we really can't see the mics very well from here, and I could see the tension building at the back of the room yesterday with people standing there and not being able to get the attention. So don't mind, I'm used to being interrupted, so just tap the mic when there's a lull. So as I said, we've got some excellent panellists, and I'll just introduce them now. We've got Linda Mellors, Managing Director and Chief Executive of Regis Aged Care. Linda's been a Chief Executive for over 15 years, both in the acute care sector and aged care. She's led major growth and transformation initiatives and currently serves on a number of boards, national boards, including Ageing Australia and Mercy Community Services. And Linda brings deep insights into governance reform, and we're really pleased to have her with us today. So if you just join me in thanking her for being present. Thank you. And we've got our second panellist is we've got Jenny Hutchins at the end, who is the CEO of Warrigal. Jenny brings a strong background both as a psychologist, an experienced leader across aged care and education and community services. She's a Churchill Fellow, and Jenny is known for her advocacy on behalf of vulnerable populations and for working closely with government to influence policy. She currently serves on several boards and is recognised for her community-focused and values-driven leadership. So let's welcome Jenny to the stage. Thank you. And last but not least, we've got Chris, who is the CEO of Helping Hand Aged Care, which provides services to thousands of older South Australians, both in the residential and home care setting, with a background in professional services, finance and healthcare. And Chris brings broad leadership experience and a strong focus on governance, strategy and service improvement. And probably what's quite unique about Chris is he served on the Helping Hand board for 8 years before jumping across to be Chief Executive, so he can understands both elements. So really excited to have a conversation about how we can get organisational governance really lined up to deliver the outcome that we want to deliver, and you want to deliver as a sector. But before I do that, I've been told I've got 5 minutes to just do a bit of a scene setting, and I was the youngest of 5 children, and I've got 5 children, so I love opportunities where I can speak uninterrupted, right? So I really use them to best effect. So look, I think the good news for you in the residential sector, who are delivering residential services, is that really the governance you've already done a bit of heavy lifting, because the governance obligations around board composition and structure and the subcommittees, they were introduced in December 2022 under the current legislation. So they don't significantly change, and for those of you who are delivering residential services to over 40 people, you've already made that adjustment. I think what the new Act and the standards do is, in relation to governance, is make explicit what was probably previously implicit, into the wide range of things that a governing body and the senior executive need to be managing to deliver care well. And so really what I'm keen to use the time we have to do is to hear from Jenny, Linda and Chris about their experience of both good and bad governance and how you harness it to best effect. Because many of you probably take this for granted, but the delivery of residential services is complex. It's complex because you're delivering care to a vulnerable population 24/7 for 24 hours a day, and I don't think that's on the easy end of the spectrum, particularly when those services need to be delivered safely in a manner that respects individuals' preferences and rights, whilst also promoting promoting opportunities for every person to live their best life. And you're also doing that while also managing family dynamics that sit around that person and managing, the communication with those families. So doing that well becomes a whole lot harder without systems and frameworks in place to ensure that the different care-related activities come together at the right time in the right way to keep people safe, well cared for and happy. And I think it was a powerful story for that we heard from Jean last night, for those who were fortunate to attend the conference dinner. I know others have mentioned this, but just how quickly, care can unravel and the impression that can leave on people, even though care was, as Jean said, care was excellent for a long period of time, but in a 2-week period, things unravelled, and that shows the importance of having these disciplines in place to help manage those situations, but also to effectively learn from them. And that's why the new Act, central to the new Act, is provider-level responsibilities and moving away from that service-based approach that came with the accreditation model. And that's because we know that water ultimately runs downhill better than uphill. And so in many respects, what you want through your governance processes is exactly the same thing that we want as a regulator: assurance. When we come knocking because we think there might be a risk, we ask questions, we get information back, and what we ultimately want in every case is to be reassured that it's not something we should be worried about. But also importantly, if we do find something, we're reassured if we've got a provider that says, yeah, we do have a problem and this is how we're going to fix it. So we get assurance that way. So what we find is when we are dealing with providers that have really good, robust internal accountability mechanisms, even though you might initially talk to people like me through gritted teeth, you fairly quickly move from seeing it as an issue to being an opportunity to test the effectiveness of your existing systems and processes, right? And that's because internally providers with good assurance processes see it as an opportunity because they accept that no system is perfect, and the best systems are the ones that know they're not perfect and are able to adapt to the changing circumstances. And particularly in this environment that we operate in, we've got people who, are different people with different needs, who are growing old, and the challenges that you will face as providers will change, and your systems and processes will need to change with them. And so those governance processes are, so essential to making sure that you are as adaptable as possible. So embracing the change, and using governance for the purpose it is intended, will put you on the right path. So we're going to have a look at what that looks like in practice. And even though I can only vaguely see you, you do look like people who can probably do 2 things at once. Do you think you can do 2 things at once? No? Well, I want you to do 2 Mentimeter questions, and we're not going to go to the responses, but we're going to kick off the conversation so we don't waste any time. But I've got two questions that are going to scroll through. In one word, what comes to mind, positive or negative, when you think about the term governance? And then that will scroll on to, in one word, where do you think your board adds value? And if your answer is nowhere, well, say that, because that will be an interesting reflection point when we get to sort of unpack that when we come to Q&A from the floor. So we'll scroll through those questions, and then we'll go to the panel. So thank you again for being involved. So really a question for the three of you, but I'll start with you, Linda. Is, you know, you've got a really sort of diverse background and obviously a lot of experience. You run a big organisation. You know, how's your background informed the way you view governance? And also, how's that helped you manage what, as I said, is a complex organisation?
Thanks, Peter, and it's great to be here talking about governance, something that I feel really strongly about. So I always tell people I'm a science nerd by background, long academic pathway, which means that data and evidence form part of my decision-making and part of the transparency up and down our organisation. I also, very early on, was appointed as a company secretary at a time when I didn't know what one was. There is a course called the Accidental Company Secretary, so I'm not the only person who found myself suddenly in a role that was all about governance. So I ended up attending every board meeting from the age of about 28. And I started on strategy and governance, and then I moved across to operations and running big services. So it was a great preparation for the rest of my career. And I spent some time last night thinking about the complexity of aged care, because aged care is so much more complex than people outside our system recognise. And as someone who came across from the hospital system, which was really complex as well, but in quite different ways. And I was thinking about the complexity of residential aged care, and I wrote myself a little list, right? Because we are providing clinical care, personal care, lots of service coordination. We also take the role of social workers. So our registered nurses end up talk about working to your full scope of practice, whereas in a hospital setting, you'd ring the social worker to come down and see the patient, or you'd ring another specialist area. In our services, it's normally the registered nurses. We're also providing a home, so there's lots of property considerations and keeping the properties working well, and all properties have a lifespan, so you're thinking a lot around capital and capital development. We're providing a catering service as well for lots of different needs and preferences, as you said, usually 6 meals a day our services are providing. We provide hotel services, so we're doing the cleaning and the laundry. We're also engagement and entertainment services, and we're businesses, regardless of ownership type. So I had always run not-for-profits and government services before I came across here, but the metrics actually are all the same, and we all need to make some kind of a margin to protect the interests of our residents and of our employees. And we're big employers as well. So if you think about the complexity of all of that, very difficult for one person to be across all of those areas, which brings me to the benefit of a strong governance system and making sure that you have a board of directors with the span of expertise that you need to be able to safely run your business. The other thing I did just want to mention, from a governance perspective, in our services, clinical governance is just as important as corporate governance. And it's vital that our boards have training in clinical governance, that we teach them how to read our data, teach them how to interrogate management, because good governance produces better outcomes. So the more we can prepare our directors, the better.
Thanks. Thank you for that. What about Jenny? What's your reflections on your journey to this point?
Yeah, thank you. Interestingly, I moved from early learning and care and out of school hours care and inclusion services to Warrigal, to aged care, and I work on Dharawal country too. Warrigal stands for, in Aboriginal language, for wild dog, as it started on Mount Warrigal. And interestingly, I think a number of people said, isn't that a wild change? And besides 70 or 80 years, it's actually not. I love having the privilege of working in this sector, and certainly the collegiality of experience from colleagues in this room and outside of this room has been a hallmark for me. And as Peter said, I'm a psychologist by trade, and I see the work of the board. I'll say a couple of things about the board, but I see the work of the board working in with my psychology framework, because I feel like it's a bit of a therapeutic relationship. And just sit with me for a minute on this, because a good therapist or psychologist is your critical friend. They're sitting on your shoulder and they're asking you those questions sometimes you don't want to be asked. And they're also asking you questions to make you a better person and to get better outcomes. They're your cheerleader on the sideline. And I feel like that's what a board is required to do. They're there to ask and interrogate and ask those difficult, challenging questions. They're there to keep me and the executive accountable, but they're my critical friend as well. They're the cheerleader on the sideline. So I really appreciate it. In psychology terms, there's a test called the selective attention test, and I'd ask you to Google it when you've got the time. And basically what it is you set the scene and there's people bouncing a basketball, and you bounce it from one person to another. I think Linda's smiling, she's seen this. And you ask the people to count the bounces that go from one person to another, not the one that goes like this. At the end of that, you say to the people, who saw the gorilla walking through that? And most people do not. But a gorilla, a person in a gorilla suit, walks through, bounces, pounds their chests and walks out again. And that's because they're focused on one stimuli. And that's us. We're focused on the stimuli within our organisation, but we want the board to look for the gorilla. So I often see and think about my board as looking for the gorilla and helping me see that gorilla so I'm a better CEO. And their job is to help me be the best CEO possible. And I'm on a couple of boards to make me a better CEO. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Pete.
And I did that test and I missed the gorilla.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
I did too.
What about you, Chris? As I said, you've sat on both sides of the equation and ended up as the Chief Executive.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So I would say that one of the fundamental things that helped get me to where I am and having such an appreciation for governance is back 25 years ago, I did the company directors course. It was one of the best things I did. It changed my view on how organisations can operate and the importance of this very nice little model that has stuck with me since then around the three legs of the stool, which is strategy, leadership and governance. And if one of those things isn't working, your organisation's really going to struggle, and I've seen that time and time again. So you might have the best strategy and the best leadership, but if the governance isn't right, things go wrong pretty quickly. And on it goes. So that was really fundamental for me. And then, like Jenny and Linda, I wanted to get onto boards to get that experience of not just being an executive reporting up, but sitting on the other side of the fence and understanding what's important and how to oversee and gain oversight of an organisation when you're not in it. That led me, very lucky to join Helping Hand, and I was there for 8 years, and I guess when I joined it was a voluntary, more of an advisory board, I would say, and the CEO did a very good job. But in terms of what I would classify as good governance, it probably needed a fair bit of uplift. And I'm pleased to say that the journey over the last 6 years, first thing I did when I joined the board, when I moved from board to CEO, which was an interesting transition in its own right, was we commissioned a board review. And that was a great fundamental starting point to say, okay, well, here's the list of things that we could do to improve and lift ourselves to be really good governance. And that's been a really interesting and lengthy journey, and it's also about continuous improvement. It's never finished.
So I think all of you have talked about the power of the question, and it's something that often we as a commission, when we're sort of supervising particularly at a service level traditionally, have found that if you're asked the right question, suddenly there can be change because people are responding to the questions you're asking, and that's certainly one of the things we've found as we've moved to the provider level, is that a lot of the change is now more sustained, because when we worked at a service level, when we left, the accountability mechanism left. So that's why we really draw in the provider, because when we leave, the provider's still interested in the same questions. So I think that's a really powerful thing. I think, and also, Linda, you mentioned about, being challenged, and I think you've all said it to some extent. You're working for an ASX-listed company, so you're well and truly used to sort of the requirements around independent directorship, etc. So I'm really interested in your reflections on when you've been challenged in a way that's changed your mind, right? Because you're someone who's got a strong view on things. So it'd be really interesting to hear an example of where you've been challenged by your board to think in a new way and respond to something differently.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and you do want healthy tension. So healthy tension is something that we should be striving for around our board tables. If you have no tension, it's not operating properly. If you have unhealthy tension, it's not operating properly. Healthy tension is a good thing. I think the best example I can think of is the pandemic. So I'd only been with Regis for 3 or 4 months before we heard of the coronavirus, and I'd come from a hospital setting. I'd had some exposure to aged care, but not nearly enough in the midst of a Royal Commission and at the beginning of a pandemic. My science brain saw the exponential growth curve and said, this is going to be really bad. Really bad. And I had some very robust conversations with people from the department who thought I was catastrophising and overreacting. I thought I was seeing a problem that perhaps others couldn't see. So then our board, the arrangement I came to with the board was we had weekly meetings from when we first heard about the coronavirus. So we front-ended the governance and the challenge. I had 2 founders on my board as well as the independent directors. So I had the really deep knowledge of aged care as well as people with really broad experience across Australia and overseas. So the challenges were numerous in terms of our thinking as an executive team, and our executive team was changing over that time as well. So I still remember the day our former chief nurse, who might be here, she was here yesterday, walked in. I said, I'm so glad you're here. We've got a pandemic. It was in March. I said, and I've been pretending to run it, so now you're here. I'd love for you to take that on. So Melissa, if you're here, we're still very grateful. But just making sure that the board balanced what we thought we needed to do from a clinical perspective, but again, recognising the complexity that this is still somebody's home environment. We had people coming in from hospitals who didn't understand why we would have soft furnishings and not stainless steel benches. So how could we possibly control the infection risk? And some of the controls we wanted to put in, the board would say, I think that's not balanced. So the challenges that they gave to us were really mostly about balance and getting the safety, the psychological care of our residents, the psychosocial care, as well as the clinical protection. The other thing we did that I still think is one of the best things our board ever did, because we front-ended all of that planning and testing of our COVID preparations, by the time we got hit by an outbreak, they were happy to step back and say, management now needs to respond, and then we kept them updated or less regular meetings because we were so slammed with the work of the response.
Look, and that leads nicely into the sort of next question I've got for Chris, which is, given you've sat on both sides of the equation, Chris, in the organisation, you know, how you manage that boundary between the operational and the strategic. There needs to be that tension and separation of duties, but what do you see as the line?
I think the days of the role of the board used to be hire and fire the CEO and monitor the strategy. And as much as we would probably like that, it's a different environment in this sector. And one of the observations I've made is, pardon me, as the regulatory, since the Royal Commission and the regulatory reform has unfolded, is that boards are being encouraged to get much more engaged in operations. And some boards, from talking to colleagues around the sector, some boards take that very literally, where they get far too involved and, you know, giving input into menus and whatnot, versus boards who are, you know, very, very removed and really don't have a good understanding. So I think trying to find that middle ground is a delicate balance. It does require a lot on CEOs and executives to work closely with their chairs and their boards. I think it is one of the fundamental relationships. On reflection, I would sort of think that I probably put at least a quarter to a third of my time as chief executive into board management. And it's not having coffees, that's actually thinking about what information needs to be presented, how is that going to be helpful, how do we separate information from insights, and that constant tension of providing enough information to keep the board informed versus overwhelming them with every single data point that no one can make any sense of. That's a constant tension. But I think I like the terminology, you know, noses in, fingers out. So yes, please take an active interest. We encourage that. We encourage you to come on the site tours every so often. We encourage you to go to our leadership forums with staff so you can speak to our staff and get an understanding of the culture. We encourage them to come to things like this. All of those are really important aspects of building trust, because it doesn't matter. You might have the thing with the board and executive, you might have the best processes and governance and everything in the world. When things go wrong, it's your culture that's going to tell whether you've actually got a strong organisation. And so that is so important as to how have you really developed, strengthened, made that culture really clear. So that stands you in good stead during a crisis, which I'm happy to talk about later.
Yeah, look, I think it's good to stay in the culture because you can have the best frameworks and you can tick all the boxes, but it's the culture that drives an organisation. So I might get Jenny, if you've got some observations, and then Linda, because I think this is a really important topic.
I am absolutely passionate about a strong, positive, flourishing and thriving culture. And I think numerous Royal Commissions have said that culture is a protective factor for vulnerable people, and we heard in the complaints session about the importance of our people, about training and engaging them, about valuing them, about permission to do their job and engaging with our older people. And I'm just going to do a little brag, because I try and do this little brag everywhere. We've got about 2,300 staff. We had a 98% return rate on our cultural engagement survey in May. 98%. It broke all records in terms of the third-party contractor that we used, and we improved on every outcome, 73 questions, every question we improved on, because we've invested deeply. But that investment has had an outcome for us in terms of the reduction of turnover, the attraction of staff, the importance of putting our clients and at the centre of who we are and what we do, and messaging that from the board and me and the executive. And so if you don't have a strong culture, you don't get the shout out and up culture of your people when they're seeing something that's not right, they're hearing something that's not right, and they've told someone and it's gone nowhere, and they've told someone else and it's gone nowhere. We absolutely encourage persistence. We want to know that we want them to know they've got the right to shout out and shout up so we can make the best outcomes possible for older people. But that doesn't come without leadership. And we must have a strong leadership culture. So we've been rolling out leadership programs as well so that we can say you've got permission to do your job. And that's all with the support of the board, because I want accountability, and I want that accountability to look like a house, if you like, and we're in the house and we're managing the house, but the board is the roof of that house, and they've got the elements to protect us from the outside elements. We're giving them the accountability frameworks, and we're giving them the measures that they can actually test and question us. I won't go on because I could go on forever.
No, I think you know, the Banking Royal Commission pointed out that it was a breakdown in culture when the bank said, oh, we need some more rules to not do things, when, you know, the Royal Commission rightly said, well, you shouldn't need rules for those sorts of things. So what does that look like? How do you build a culture from the top down? So what does that look like in practice? Linda or Chris or Jenny, you've got...
I'm happy to start with that, because I agree with you. Culture is absolutely critical, and the board should be setting the culture. In our service, because we are dealing with vulnerable people, transparency and trust and integrity are the three words that I would use every day of the week. Integrity will stop you from needing a rule for everything that you should know is wrong. You know, we used to say policies and procedures are to manage the outliers. You know, most people know the right thing to do. You have to have a policy or procedure to manage the outliers. But your integrity is the thing that should stand you in good stead. Transparency. Some boards don't want to hear bad news. It's always a red flag, because it will stop people from being transparent. It removes the opportunity to improve with the board's support and encouragement. I think, you know, reading the Fin Review, which I read these days, I never used to read it, but I read it every day now, there is a daily example of a failure of culture. Often in an Australian company, and on the days an Australian company isn't there, it'll be an international one. And it all comes down to culture. And you can see ineffective boards that might have all of the good frameworks in place, but they're not effective. And why aren't they effective? Because it's the way that it's lived.
Yes. So it's building that psychological safety, isn't it, where people can be who they are, but also be able to have those sort of robust conversations. Chris, did you have anything to add to that from your perspective? And then we might go to just look at what people think of their boards and go to other questions that I can see starting to be fed through.
You can drive culture and you can measure culture. There's lots of measures and metrics. It's culture surveys, it's turnover, it's retention, it's, you know, psych safety indexes. There's lots of things you can do to measure. Use of agency, all of those sorts of things. The good news travels fast and bad news travels faster is the absolute mantra that I live by, and it's worked. It just works consistently. Where we've had some issues, I'll share one with you. But just as a little snippet, we recently had an issue of a site that had gone a bit wrong. And I think, to your point, Peter, we look after thousands of people, families, people, in the complex set of interactions that happens on any given day, at any given moment. I honestly sit here and I think, I'm surprised not more goes wrong. And that's the truth. Like, when you think about the complexity of the web with which you're operating in. But we had an issue, it was an underreporting issue, with a bit of a smell about it, underreporting. We went to the Commission and said, we've got a problem, and to be fair, they've been great, right? And we worked through it together, and we had a good result. So the new approach, I think, if you have the right posture and you want to fix stuff and accept responsibility and you just want to get on with it, it's going to work, right? So I can't say enough, just things that, you know, sometimes you overreach, and that's with greatest respect, but if you cooperate, I think you're going to get a really good outcome, and we've seen that now at least once or twice. So I think that's an important point to make. The other thing I just want to share with you about good news and bad news and how you respond in a crisis, I think it's really important. About 3 months into my tenure, so I'm not from the aged care sector, I'm not a clinician, I'm a businessy person, and I've come into into this aged care, very excited, thrilled to be joining the board, joining as CEO. In the first 4 months, we had this terrible incident where a resident with quite severe dementia escaped from one of our memory support units through a series of extraordinary events. You couldn't make this stuff up, and they ended up in the neighbour's pool and they drowned, right? And that was just very, very confronting. There was all over the news. The Commission obviously was here, the police, the media, everything like that. Now, my board was not terribly engaged at that stage, so it was kind of just me and the executive team trying to work all this out. It was pretty confronting, but as a team, we just said, we're not going to hide from this. We're not going to sweep this under the carpet. We're going to own it. It's been just a tragic, tragic event. With that analogy of the bits of the Swiss cheese just line up, and there's about 12 pieces of Swiss cheese. Anyway, what it's done is that we took that and we tried to make ourselves a better organisation because of it, and we owned it. And if some of you here would have heard me speak about this before, it's not a nice thing to talk about, but the reason I like to talk about it with people like you is because it's an important story to tell. And we screwed up, all right? We did, and we owned it, and we've tried to do the very best we can ever since. So that's your culture right there, okay? So how you respond, and what the other really pleasing thing now is that with my board, again, totally different board, bad news travels up really quick. Yep, no worries, Chris, thanks for letting us know. You're in good hands, off you go, work it out. And that's what you want as a CE and as an executive team. Not a whole bunch of board members jumping and saying, I'll help you fix this. That's not helpful.
No, that's such an important story, as I said in the introduction. No system's perfect, but the good systems are the ones that recognise that and seek to adapt to the changing circumstance. So, when we get sort of initial sort of defensiveness, as I say to providers, you're just defending the system. Do you know what I mean? Like, you're not, you don't have to defend the system because no system is perfect in its own way. You make it better and better through continuous improvement. So we'll go to just to see what people's responses are, and then we'll go to some questions from the floor. So in one word, what comes to mind, positive or negative? Yep, accountability. I can't read them from there, so you might want to turn around if you can't see like I can't see. Yep. Complex, leadership, essential, safety. So look, I think the sentiment, that's positive, isn't it? Like that's a fairly positive sentiment about, what it's for. Because I have, probably going back a few years ago, because I've worked in the sort of aged care regulation now for just a bit over 3 years. When I started, people would often see it as a bit of an overhead. So I'm pleased to see that it's overall received positively. So let's go to the next one. I mean, any other comments on that from you guys?
I hope that reflects that people's experience of it has exceeded their expectations, because it was a big change for a lot of providers in the sector, especially those that had come from family businesses who were, what do you mean I need an independent director? I've got my brother-in-law. So I hope that's a good reflection.
I agree. I do also want to acknowledge that sometimes boards aren't all roses and rainbows, and it's really important to acknowledge that. And I'm sure there are people with wounds in the audience and they want to show those wounds. But it is to the heart of what I said, and I think you both said as well, it's how do we actually build those relationships, because that relationship ends up being critical to the accountability frameworks, to the strategy, to the outcomes for older people. And I strongly believe when that relationship isn't there, you can feel that as a ripple effect across the organisation. And so my investment in time, as you said, is so important in developing those relationships and not being afraid to call out where it's not going well, thinking about it before I do it, and then sitting down and having that conversation about a relationship that's not going well and how I can improve it, because you don't want to carry those wounds and you don't want to see the ripple effect across your organisation.
Can I just expand on that as well, Jenny? Sometimes directors aren't the right directors for your board, and that's a really important conversation to have as well. So the skills mix is really important, as is the attitude. If you have a single interest director or a nitpicker, they're not adding to your organisation, and a good conversation with the chair to actually, sometimes you just need to replace that director and have somebody who will enhance your organisation.
How do you manage the issue of board members becoming bystanders? So how does your board manage that, to keep everybody engaged in the conversation? Because it is easy to sometimes be a bystander on a board, or you're on your own board experiences.
Can I just take that for a minute?
Yeah.
I think it's really important to do board evaluations, and so I'll come in from that point if that's okay. And we just did one recently. We did two things: a board evaluation, and then independently of that, but linked, was the individual review of each director, their skills, their contributions, and then we looked at the board evaluation score and we developed a plan for that. And then the chair met with each independent director and spoke about the board evaluation score, the strengths, the opportunities, and then matched that to their strengths and their opportunities and designed a performance plan, or in partnership together they designed a performance plan. And that was the opportunity for my chair to be able to have those conversations about their role, their responsibility, their engagement and their approach, and that's how we've addressed it.
Yeah, I think that's great. The other thing that I do on some of the boards I sit on is we have a director give an evaluation at the end of every board meeting, and they are meant to call out things like if somebody's a bystander, they'll say not everybody contributed fully today, or it was evident that not all directors had read their papers. That's another one
big
that,
issue.
you know, we all get asked the questions. You go, if you just turn to page 3, paragraph 4, the answer will be there. So, yeah, regular evaluation.
So just a question from the floor, and I don't think we've got anyone at microphones. I don't think so. Okay, so any advice on how to navigate a board who has become too operational? So how do you manage the board, requesting more and more data, impacting workload on the chief executive and exec team? So you've probably all got something you might want to say on that, on strategies. Strategies on managing the board. Jen, go, Jen.
I've got a view on this. So we've developed a strategic plan, which I'm a bit passionate about, and then we've developed the KPIs, and that's the data that the board get. However, I acknowledge at times, and I'm like this as a non-executive director myself, that at times they might not have comfort around a certain area, and I see them in my imagination brain as levers. So we might have a finance lever, we might have a culture lever, we might have an operational lever. If there's a concern, let them come down, understand, provide comfort, but then it's my job and the chair's job to push them back up to the strategy level. So that's how I intellectualise it in my brain, and that's how I manage it with the board.
Any other comments from yourself?
I think a lot of, again, this is the investment in the board that chief executives make. It's the pre-meetings that are done with the chair, the post-meeting debriefs that are done with the chair, and then on it goes with the committees. So what you're doing is you're building up a sort of like a living or a dialogue around an issue. Because sometimes you've written the paper, and by the time it actually goes up, 5 other things have happened, and you've got to reset things. So again, it's just that dialogue. It's encouraging the deep dives in the committees. So we use our committees quite strongly for that, to have the deep discussions about more detailed bits, and then we lift the board up. So I found that works quite well, but then also it's about being really well prepared, and I encourage my executives to be prepared and think about what sort of questions do you think you might get from this, and actually try and nip them off, because otherwise a successful board meeting is not too many action items, right? That for me is my KPI, because I'm trying to let everyone get on with the work, and that we've actually preempted and thought about some of the issues that might arise. So that's my tip.
And I would support both of those comments, and I would add that I ask why. So when directors are wanting to go deep into operational data, I'll ask why.
Yeah.
Is it an assurance problem?
Yeah.
Is it an area of comfort? Because we all have directors who'll go where their comfort lies. And depending on the answer, then I'll work with the chair to make sure we get the right level. But in the end, a board can ask for whatever it wants. And if they want to see all the data, they get all the data. Then they often don't want to see it when they see how much is there. They say, can you go back to the summary level?
Although that
please?
might be a strategy,
That's
Linda.
exactly right. Peter, can I add one more thing? I think it's about the board, but it's also about, to Chris's point, prepping the staff. We actually developed new templates that reflected how the board, that deeply reflected our KPIs and our strategic plan. And then we trained our staff in writing for the board. And so we trained them in what an Archibald statement looked like and developing their skill sets in writing succinctly. And that has been an absolute game changer for us in our organisation.
So I probably generate some of that because I talk to some more passive boards and say, look, you know, because they think, oh, I've got to be an expert on everything. And I say, well, you need to be an expert at asking questions and getting an answer. And so often, because often boards are getting an answer to a question they never asked, so they find it hard to engage with the material. So I said, the more you can ask a question and then get a response, then you'll be interested in the answer because you know what the problem is you're trying to solve. And so, you know, it's the power of the question.
And can I also say that that's also the value in being on boards, because a lot of my job as the chief executive is I listen to what a director asks, I listen to the answer, and if I'm normally the one who'll detect if the answer doesn't answer the question. So that's when I will step in and either guide the executive to answer the question or I'll answer it to make sure it is asked and answered within the meeting and doesn't form an action item.
Or lead to a conversation in the corridor afterwards, which doesn't help anybody. So look, it's a shame the department's not here on the stage with me. It says, given growing responsibilities and need for experienced leadership, should the government support organisations in compensating the board members, or is it still reasonable to expect board members to serve on a volunteer basis?
I can take it from a not-for-profit perspective, and I know you're listed, but we went through we're a company limited by guaranteed, not-for-profit. We have a company membership model, so we've got 51 company members, and we asked the company members permission to remunerate the board. We changed the constitution. We went through a 12-month process, and that process was really important about building a remuneration framework that included our constitution, our policies, our procedures, a really strong nominations and remuneration committee. We commissioned papers, which we've shared with other organisations as well, about the role of the board, liabilities for the board, accountabilities for the board, and why we might consider remunerating. How boards have changed. They're no longer about working bees and their partners bringing along scones and jam and cream. This is really, really critical, accountable work. And some of our board members have been on our board 27 years. And so we were looking at a board refresh as well. So I'm going to quietly put up my hand and say I am a proponent for, interesting from where I came from, for remunerating boards for the skill and expertise and time they give an organisation, and happy to share our process should anyone be interested.
So I agree with that. So listed board now, we have professional directors. It's actually their job. Most of the boards I've sat on myself have been not-for-profit. At the beginning, none of them... I've sat on myself have been not-for-profit.
Oh, I don't know what that is.
No, that's frightening, hearing myself come back.
I don't know.
No, that's frightening.
Sorry.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, there you go. And there was a 7-second delay on that too, so there you go.
There was. Very alarming. So most of the boards I've sat on were not-for-profit and weren't remunerated. Increasingly, the not-for-profits are paying directors, and I think it is an appropriate recognition of the value of their time. And I think particularly where you have consumer representatives as well, traditionally they haven't been paid, but it's an appropriate recognition of the time.
Yeah, we pay our consumer reps and our board members as well, and we've got terms, so they've got 3 by 3 year terms, and that's the perfect opportunity to actually have the conversation about, you know, those sorts of things you were saying. Is this right for you? Have you got other interests? But yeah, it's a lot of responsibility, a lot of risk, and at the end of the day, they are so reliant on what you're telling them. That's the fundamental part of it.
Look, and then sorry for the distraction, but I've lost the questions, but luckily I have memorised them. And so, so it really feeds on. I mean, this is a diverse sector. You know, there's single service providers. You know, and it's a common question: how do you attract people to be interested in sitting on a board in areas where people might not necessarily live? So I've got a few thoughts on that, but I'm interested in any thoughts that the panel has, because it is something that we need to sort of work together on, you know, to support the sector.
It is, and the reputation of the sector here is absolutely critical, and all parts of that sector need to help improve the reputation of aged care. During the Royal Commission, a lot of the consulting groups, the big consulting groups, were advising people not to go on an aged care board because of the reputational risk. When there was the discussion of the criminal penalties, the advice everywhere was not to go on an aged care board. You have to get all of those settings right to be attractive, and the attractive part of being on an aged care board is the complexity, and we're doing such good for older people. So that's the attraction. You have to limit the risk of someone going to jail for doing good work. If people are bad and they're deliberately making poor decisions, then I think knock yourself out. But that attraction, I think, is really important. We need to get into the company directors and a lot of those other groups and really lift the profile. I think for single service boards, those boards are a really great entree to a board pathway. I'd recommend all executives find a board to go on, because it is such a rich learning environment for you. But I think there are a lot of structures we could improve.
Look, and what I say to providers who ask this question is that there are a lot of, you know, I always ask about what you've tried, because you can get people to attend virtually, you know, and then intermittently attend in person. But there are a lot of professional associations where people are looking for opportunities to sit on boards pro bono, particularly in coming out of sectors which aren't so relational. And a lot of people really enjoy the type of environment that they're sort of monitoring and governing. So you might find that there are opportunities there that you could be overlooking. And for example, like Chris, I did the company directors course a number of years ago, and there's lots of people who go through that course who are then looking for opportunities. They might sit on the board for 1 or 2 years, but you'll have a pipeline of others who might also be willing. Look, one of the questions that sort of seamlessly came through before I mucked up the machine is a really important one, and it's one that's made clearer in the. See, they've handed me another one. There you go. There you go. And it's really what the standards have made much more explicit that was otherwise implicit is how do you get that corporate and clinical governance balance right? And I think I'd like to really use the balance of the time about what that looks like in practice for you guys, because that was a big focus of the Royal Commission, and it's certainly, you know, something that is woven now into the new Act to really try to marry all of those complexities together.
So I'm happy to start with that one. So I chaired clinical governance boards before I came across to aged care, mainly in primary health, but then I was also involved in acute hospital clinical governance. In our sector, your clinical governance has to be as good as your financial governance. It just has to be. When I first joined Regis 6 years ago, I brought in a clinical governance expert and I put the board and executive through clinical governance training together so that they could hear the kinds of questions that each other were asking. I'm going to tell you an inappropriate story, but it's too good not to share. At the end of...
It's only between us.
I know, it's only between us. At the end of the session, one of the executives at the time said, I just don't get clinical governance. That was at the end of the session, and I thought, I think there is another sector that would benefit from your skills and experience, and it's not here. You have to be able to understand it. So I think putting people through extensive clinical governance training and then lots of refresher training and deep dives into the clinical, and when I talk about clinical governance, we call ours clinical governance and care committee, because the personal care forms part of our clinical governance framework. But making sure you do the deep dive so that the directors understand what it is that they're looking at. And then we also taught them and we fed them the questions that you should ask from a clinical governance perspective and the kinds of answers that they should expect to hear. But it means for us now, the directors will say, if they don't understand something, they'll ask for a deep dive on it now. They'll just say, you know, can we have one of those special sessions where you tell us what it is that we're looking at? But our clinical governance expertise is really lifted.
We'll move to the others, but it's an interesting reflection because many moons ago I did a medico-legal job for a large acute care hospital and I worked for a chief executive who'd come from Wales. And of course, I think at the time, all of the Australian health system was about equivalent to what was in Wales. Yeah, so, and she said to me, you know, I can survive, you know, a significant overspend, but I can't ever survive a major clinical governance issue on my watch. You know, and that's always kind of stuck in my mind because that's true. You can deal with the reputational pain of perhaps overspending, but if something significant's happened on your watch, she said, I'll never work again. So it's an interesting dynamic and getting boards to be focused on that. So go to perhaps Jenny, you look like you're keen to sort of add something to that.
Always keen to have a comment. We've got someone with Masters of Dementia, we've got a Professor of Nursing, and we've got a nurse on our board. We've got a Care Governance Committee, so not dissimilar to you, with a whole range of data and analytics and benchmarking of that so that they can ask any question they like, any root cause analyses we do, they go through that so they can see the work we're doing on critical issues across the organisation. We prioritise our homes to look at where have we got high risk and why, and what are the categories we've put them in and why. I'm not a clinician, and I'm really hyper aware I'm not a clinician, so actually enhancing that clinical skill set around me so that we provide the best quality service possible is really, really important to me. We link up our QCAB and CAB, and once again I lent on the expertise, including Linda and her colleagues across the organisation to understand how we designed it across our organisation. So we've designed our QCAB and CAB so they add value, and I just think you're crazy to have a QCAB and CAB unless you embed them in the organisation to add value. And so we've made sure they've got a link and a line to our Care Governance Committee, which obviously has a reporting mechanism to the board, as does our CAB. So that's how we've designed it in a high-level way.
Look, and you can see this is a conversation that never ends, but an important one, and I think it's one that we have to work together on to get it to where it needs to be. Probably just final comments because we're down to the wire now. We'll finish with you, Chris. Any sort of reflections on getting that balance between corporate and clinical governance right before we finish up?
I think it's been covered. We had a very similar model. The consumer advisory body we found tremendously valuable, both from a strategic perspective, and we use them for all sorts of wonderful things. And I think it's just been so powerful. And just one meeting I just won't miss. It's just so valuable more so than doing the tours of the homes and you know, everyone's got the place all spick and span, and sometimes it feels like a bit like industrial tourism, but to actually talk to consumers about their experiences and get their views on our policies, procedures, strategies, frame, whatever, so valuable. So yeah, I agree.
Yep. And that, look, and that wasn't a set-up. I think we can finish on the point that, as I said at the outset, if you can harness the structures that the Act requires you to harness, rather than see them as a task to be performed, then it will put you in good stead. So we'll finish there, but I'd just like to, if you could just join me in thanking Linda, Chris and Jenny.